Cancer was eating me alive, but the only thing consuming my son, Raymond, was greed for my estate. He demanded his inheritance, furious that my fight for life was too expensive. He never suspected my secret weapon, a solid insurance plan, or that my last act on this earth would be to teach him the true meaning of loss through my will. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Delia Ramsey, and at 71, I had always considered myself a woman of reasonable foresight, a planner. My late husband, Arthur, God rest his soul, used to tease me about my meticulous budgeting, my neatly filed insurance policies, my insistence on having all our ducks in a row. He was the dreamer, the optimist. I was the pragmatist, the one who worried about rainy days even when the sun was shining. It was a balance that had served us well through nearly 5 decades of marriage, through raising our son, Raymond, and through the quiet, comfortable retirement we had envisioned together before Arthur was taken by a sudden heart attack 3 years prior. Now, however, all my careful planning felt like a flimsy shield against the storm that had just broken over my life. The oncologist, a kind woman with tired eyes named Dr. Chen, had delivered the news with a gentle gravity that nonetheless landed like a physical blow. Cancer. Not just any cancer, but an aggressive form that would require an equally aggressive and undoubtedly costly regimen of treatments. Surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. The words swirled in my mind, a terrifying lexicon of my new reality. Sitting in her sterile office, the scent of antiseptic sharp in my nostrils, I had nodded, asked what I hoped were intelligent questions, my mind a strange mixture of numb shock and a familiar ingrained pragmatism. What are the chances? What are the side effects? What about my insurance? That last question at least had a somewhat reassuring answer. Arthur and I, in our careful planning days, had invested in a comprehensive medical insurance policy, one we'd paid into faithfully for decades. Dr. Chen confirmed it was excellent, top tier. It would cover the majority of the astronomical costs that were about to descend upon me. A small, cold comfort in a sea of fear. The true fear, the one that settled deeper than the dread of physical suffering, was the thought of facing this alone. Raymond, my only child, now 42, lived just across town. He was a financial advisor, successful in his own right, or so he always portrayed. After Arthur died, our relationship had shifted. The easy warmth we once shared had been replaced by a certain dutiful distance on his part. His visits became less frequent, his calls shorter, often tinged with an impatience I couldn't quite decipher. He had his own life, his own ambitions, I told myself. He was busy. When I called him from the hospital parking lot after Dr. Chen's devastating pronouncement, my voice trembling so much I could barely form the words, his reaction was muted. "Oh Mom, that's terrible news," he'd said a beat too late, his tone more surprised than heartbroken. "Are you sure they got it right? Maybe you should get a second opinion." Then almost immediately, "What did they say about, your affairs? Is everything in order?" My affairs. Not my fear, not my pain, not the terrifying uncertainty of my future, but my affairs. A cold fist clenched around my heart. "The doctors are hopeful, Raymond," I'd said, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. "The insurance is good. But it's going to be a long, hard fight." Right, he'd replied, his voice already sounding distracted. "Well, I'm here for you, Mom. Let me know what you need. I've got a big client meeting now, but we'll talk soon." He'd hung up before I could say another word. In the weeks that followed, as I began the grueling cycle of initial tests, consultations, and the first debilitating rounds of chemotherapy, Raymond's support manifested as occasional brief visits. He'd arrive at my small, tidy home, the one Arthur and I had filled with love and laughter, looking out of place in his expensive suit, his eyes flicking around the familiar, slightly worn furniture with an appraising air. He'd ask perfunctory questions about my treatment, his gaze often drifting to the stack of medical pamphlets on my coffee table, or to the calendar where my numerous appointments were starkly circled in red. "Are you keeping track of all these bills, Mom?" he asked one afternoon, picking up a statement from the radiology department. "These things can get out of hand. You need to be organized." "My insurance is handling most of it, Raymond," I reminded him gently. "It's a very good policy." "Still," he persisted, It's important to know where everything stands. For planning purposes. Your will, your estate. Is all that up to date? Dad always said you were the organized one. His preoccupation with my finances, with my estate, became a recurring, unsettling theme. He'd bring it up obliquely, couched in terms of helping me manage things, or ensuring my wishes are respected. He offered to review my paperwork, to consolidate my accounts, to make things easier for me during my illness. Each offer felt less like genuine concern and more like a vulture circling, waiting. I was no fool. My mind, though often clouded by the fog of chemotherapy and the ever-present ache of my illness, was still sharp. I saw the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of the value of my modest home, the one Arthur and I had paid off years ago. I noticed his subtle inquiries about my small investment portfolio, the one we'd built for our rainy day, a day that had now arrived with the force of a monsoon. His wife, Cynthia, rarely accompanied him. When she did, her sympathy felt even more superficial than Raymond's, her primary concern seeming to be how my illness might disrupt their social schedule or their vague plans for a European vacation. My old friends, bless them, rallied. Martha from my church group brought casseroles. Joan from my bridge club called every other day. Their genuine warmth was a stark contrast to the cool, calculating concern emanating from my own son. The cancer treatments were brutal, leaving me weak, nauseous, my hair falling out in clumps. I spent many days confined to my bed, the walls of my room feeling like they were closing in. And in those long, lonely hours, the fear wasn't just of the disease ravaging my body, but of the son who seemed to be waiting with a chilling patience for it to run its course. My illness, my potential demise, had become, in his eyes, not a tragedy to be mourned, but an opportunity to be managed, an estate to be settled. The seed of a painful, almost unbearable unease about his true motives had been planted, and it was beginning to take root in the fertile ground of my maternal fear. The chemotherapy treatments, as Dr. Chen had gently warned, were indeed a brutal assault on my already weary body. Each session left me more depleted than the last, a hollowed-out version of myself. The nausea was a constant, unwelcome companion, and a profound fatigue settled into my bones, making even the simplest tasks feel like climbing a mountain. My hair, once a source of quiet pride with its distinguished silver streaks, began to fall out in alarming clumps, littering my pillow each morning like a sad, gray snow. I took to wearing soft cotton scarves around the house not just for warmth, but to avoid the constant painful reminder of what this disease was stealing from me. Raymond's visits, if they could even be called that, continued in their sporadic, unsettling fashion. He'd appear at my door, always impeccably dressed, a stark contrast to my own increasingly frail and disheveled state. He'd bring no flowers, no comforting soup, just that same air of impatient duty and an unnerving focus on my affairs. He'd ask about my latest symptoms with a detached air, his gaze often drifting past me to the small antique writing desk where I kept my important papers, or to the framed photograph of Arthur and me on our 25th anniversary, a reminder of happier, more secure times. "Are you feeling any better today, Mom?" he'd ask, already pulling out his phone to check his messages. "A little tired, dear," I'd reply, my voice thin. "The chemo really takes it out of me." "Right," he'd say, his attention clearly elsewhere. "So, about that investment portfolio Dad left, have you had a chance to review the statements I brought over? We really should consolidate those accounts, make them easier to manage. For you, of course. Easier for me or easier for him to access?" The unspoken question hung heavy in the air between us. I tried to steer the conversation towards my health, my fears, my need for some genuine emotional support, but he'd always deftly bring it back to finances, to paperwork, to the practicalities of my situation. It was as if my illness, my fight for life, was merely a series of administrative tasks to be ticked off a list, a prelude to the main event, the settling of my estate. The medical bills, as predicted, began to arrive in a relentless, terrifying flood. Thick envelopes detailing staggering sums for consultations, for scans, for the potent chemical cocktails being pumped into my veins. I'd stack them on the kitchen table, a monument to my body's betrayal and the astronomical cost of trying to stay alive. My excellent insurance, Arthur's final act of loving foresight, was indeed covering the lion's share. But the sheer volume of paperwork, the co-pays, the out-of-network charges I still had to manage, was overwhelming in my weakened state. It was during one particularly bad week, when I was reeling from a chemotherapy session that had left me barely able to lift my head from the pillow, that Raymond chose to make his move. I was in my bed, the curtains drawn against the harsh afternoon light, feeling nauseous, weak, and utterly desolate. The metallic taste of the drugs was a constant torment in my mouth. My head, now almost completely bare beneath my softest scarf, ached. He let himself in with the key I'd given him years ago, his footsteps unnervingly brisk in my usually quiet home. He came into my bedroom without knocking, his presence filling the small space with an unwelcome, vibrant energy that seemed to mock my own profound depletion. "Mom," he said, his voice a little too loud. "You awake?" I managed a weak nod, my eyes fluttering open. He was standing at the foot of my bed, looking down at me, not with concern but with that familiar, appraising glint. "Feeling rough, huh?" he observed almost casually. "Well, try to pull yourself together for a minute. There's something important we need to discuss." I struggled to sit up, my body protesting with every movement. "What is it, Raymond?" I whispered, my throat dry. "Can't it wait?" "Not really, Mom," he said, pulling up my small bedside chair, its legs scraping harshly against the wooden floor. He leaned forward, his expression suddenly intent, almost predatory. "Look, we both know this cancer thing, it's serious. Dr. Chen is good, but let's be realistic. You need to get your affairs in order properly. And frankly, Mom, I've been thinking about my future, about the opportunities one have right now." My heart began to pound with a slow, sickening dread. I knew with a chilling certainty where this was going. "I've got this incredible investment opportunity, Mom," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, urgent tone. "A once-in-a-lifetime chance. But the window is closing fast. I need capital, a significant amount, and I need it now." He paused, his eyes boring into mine. "So, I was thinking it would make things a lot simpler, a lot more practical for everyone if you just advanced me my share of the inheritance now. While you're still, able to make those decisions clearly." The words, so baldly stated, so utterly devoid of compassion, hung in the air like a toxic miasma. My share of the inheritance. While I lay there, fighting for my life, ravaged by cancer and chemotherapy, my son, my only child, was asking for his inheritance. He wasn't asking if I was in pain, if I was scared, if I needed anything. He was asking for his money, as if I were already gone, my life already tallied up and ready for distribution. He saw the look of horror on my face, the tears that welled in my eyes, and his expression hardened. "Oh, don't look at me like that, Mom," he said, a dismissive wave of his hand. "It's just practical, sensible. Given your serious diagnosis, why let it all get tied up in probate later? I have needs now. And honestly," he added, his voice taking on a cruel, almost accusatory edge, "you should probably reconsider some of these overly expensive treatments anyway. To preserve the family estate. For those of us who will live on. To preserve the estate. For him. By implication, by me dying sooner, or at least cheaper." The room spun. The metallic taste in my mouth intensified, a bitter cocktail of drugs and despair. This was my son. The boy I had loved, nurtured, sacrificed for. And he was standing here at my sickbed, essentially asking me to hurry up and die so he could get his hands on my money. The ghoulish opportunism of it, the sheer, unadulterated greed, was a blow more devastating than any physical pain the cancer could inflict. My carefully constructed world, my belief in the fundamental goodness of my own child, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. My affairs indeed. He was certainly making them his primary concern. The door clicked shut behind Raymond, leaving a silence in my small bedroom that was more deafening than any shout. His words, "Preserve the family estate for those of us who will live on," echoed in the sterile air, a monstrous testament to the son I had apparently never truly known. I lay there, amidst the crumpled sheets and the lingering scent of antiseptic from my last chemotherapy drip, and felt a coldness seep into my bones that had nothing to do with my illness. It was the chill of a profound, soul-deep disillusionment. My son, my Raymond, the boy whose first steps I had cheered, whose fevers I had nursed, whose small hand I had held on the first day of school. The man whose university education Arthur and I had so proudly supported, whose wedding we had celebrated with such joy, whose own children, my grandchildren, I had adored. That man, it seemed, had been a carefully constructed illusion, or perhaps a memory I had clung to long after he had vanished, replaced by this this inheritance vulture circling my sickbed with impatient greed. The tears that came were not the hot, cleansing tears of fresh grief I had shed for Arthur. These were cold, bitter tears of betrayal, of a mother's love so callously, so cruelly spurned. He hadn't just asked for money. He had effectively asked for my death warrant, suggesting I curtail my treatments to ensure his financial future. The ghoulish opportunism of it, the sheer, unadulterated selfishness, was a revelation more devastating than any cancer diagnosis. For hours I lay there, the world a blur of pain, the physical ache of my ravaged body, the searing agony of my shattered heart. I thought of Arthur, my practical, loving Arthur. He had always been so meticulous about our finances, so insistent on that comprehensive medical insurance. For peace of mind, Delia, he'd always said. So neither of us ever has to be a burden or make impossible choices if one of us gets sick. Oh, Arthur, if only you could see how that foresight was now being twisted, how our son saw not peace of mind, but an estate to be preserved, a life to be devalued against the cold calculus of his own desires. But as the initial storm of despair began to subside, something else stirred within me, something that surprised me with its quiet, steely resilience. My mind, though often fogged by medication and fatigue, had always been my sharpest tool. I was Delia Ramsey, a woman who had balanced household budgets on a shoestring, who had navigated complex insurance claims after Arthur's passing, who had always read the fine print. And even now, in my weakened state, that part of me, the astute, pragmatic part, began to awaken. Raymond, in his greedy impatience, had made a critical error. He had assumed my illness had rendered me entirely helpless, my mind as frail as my body. He had seen the terrifying stacks of medical bills arriving daily, for the surgery, the chemotherapy, the endless tests and consultations, and had clearly leaped to the conclusion that my estate, our shared legacy from Arthur, was being rapidly depleted. He saw those bills as a threat to his inheritance. He didn't know, or perhaps in his self-absorption had conveniently forgotten, the specifics of that excellent insurance policy Arthur and I had so diligently maintained. He didn't know that while the charges were indeed astronomical, the actual out-of-pocket expenses for me, after the insurance paid its substantial share, would be manageable, albeit still a burden. He saw the gross figures, the terrifying totals, and his greed had blinded him to any other possibility. A plan, sad and painful but born of a desperate need to understand the true depths of his character, began to form in my weary mind. It wasn't a plan for fiery revenge, not in the way some might imagine. I was too tired, too sick for grand confrontations. My fight was for my life, for every precious day Dr. Chin and her team could give me. But this was a different kind of fight. A fight for truth. A fight to unmask the son I had raised, to see, once and for all, if any shred of the loving boy I remembered still existed beneath the grasping, callous man who had stood at my bedside. I would let him believe the worst about the bills. I would let him see the raw, terrifying numbers, the ones that arrived before the insurance adjustments, the ones that screamed financial ruin. I would present them to him not as a plea for help, for I knew now, with a certainty that ached in my soul, that no true help would be forthcoming from him, but as a test. A final, heartbreaking test of his character. What would he do when faced with the apparent decimation of his precious inheritance? Would there be a flicker of concern for me, his mother, facing not just a life-threatening illness but also financial catastrophe? Would there be an offer of support, however small, however symbolic? Or would his reaction be purely one of selfish panic, of anger at his loss? The thought of such a deliberate, almost clinical observation of my own son's moral failings filled me with a profound sadness. This wasn't how a mother should have to view her child. But Raymond had forced my hand. He had turned our relationship into a transaction, my life into a line item on his anticipated balance sheet. So I began to gather them, the bills from the hospital, the oncologist, the radiology lab, the pharmacy. Each one a stark white reminder of my body's battle. I didn't look for the explanation of benefits statements from the insurance company that usually followed, the ones that showed the dramatically reduced amounts I actually owed. Those I tucked away safely in my desk drawer. For Raymond, only the raw, terrifying totals would do. It was a grim task, this preparation for a son's moral reckoning. Each bill I added to the growing pile felt like another nail in the coffin of the relationship I had once cherished. But my sharp mind, the one he had so readily dismissed, saw the necessity of it. I needed to know. I needed to see him, unvarnished, stripped of any pretense of filial concern, reacting to what he believed was the imminent loss of everything he truly valued. My illness had made me vulnerable, yes. But it had also given me a strange, almost brutal clarity. When you're fighting for your life, the superficialities fall away. You see people for who they truly are. And I, Delia Ramsey, was about to see the unadulterated truth of my son Raymond. The prospect filled me not with anticipation but with a deep, sorrowful dread. This was a test I desperately hoped he would pass, even as my heart told me he was destined to fail. The day Raymond was next due to visit, a heavy, oppressive stillness filled my small home. The pile of medical bills sat on my coffee table, a stark white mountain range of terrifying figures, each one a testament to my body's ongoing war with the cancer that ravaged it. I had spent the morning in a state of quiet, internal preparation, not for a battle of wills, but for a painful unveiling of truth. My heart ached with a premonitory sorrow. I knew with a mother's intuition that had rarely failed me except perhaps in judging the true depths of my own son's character, that this test was one Raymond was almost certain to fail. Yet some stubborn, perhaps foolish, part of me still clung to a sliver of hope that I might be wrong, that the sight of this overwhelming financial burden might awaken some dormant ember of compassion, of filial concern within him. I was resting on the sofa, propped up with pillows, the effort of just showering and dressing leaving me breathless and weak. My scarf, a soft cashmere Arthur had given me years ago, felt comforting against my now almost entirely bare scalp. I heard his key in the lock. He still had one, a relic from a time when his visits were a comfort, not a source of dread. And then his footsteps, a little too brisk, a little too self-important, approaching the living room. "Mom?" he called out, his voice holding that familiar edge of impatience. "You in here? Cynthia said you sounded a bit off on the phone yesterday." Cynthia, his wife, whose calls to me were as rare and as welcome as a tax audit. "In here, Raymond," I said, my voice thinner than I intended. He appeared in the doorway, looking dapper in a tailored sports coat, his gaze sweeping the room before it landed on me, then with a slight frown on the formidable stack of envelopes on the coffee table. "What's all that?" he asked, his tone already suspicious, as if I might be hiding assets from him even as I lay there, a shadow of my former self. "Those, Raymond," I said, gesturing towards the pile with a trembling hand, "are the bills. From the hospital, the specialists, the chemotherapy, the scans, all of it. They just keep coming." I let a weary sigh escape me, a sigh that was only partly feigned. The reality of those bills, even knowing my insurance would eventually cover most of them, was still a terrifying weight. He walked over, picked up the top few envelopes, his eyes widening as he scanned the bold red, amount due figures. I saw his jaw tighten, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He was, I knew, mentally calculating, subtracting these sums from the estate he so clearly considered his own. "Good Lord, Mom," he finally said, his voice a mixture of shock and something else, annoyance? Accusation? This is astronomical. How could you let it get this high?" The question, so utterly devoid of concern for me, for my suffering, for the battle I was waging for my very life, was like a cold knife twisting in my heart. But I kept my expression carefully neutral, my voice quiet. "It's what the treatments cost, Raymond," I replied. "The ones Dr. Chen says I need if I'm to have any chance." He began to pace the small living room, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his agitation palpable. But your insurance, Mom. Dad always said you had excellent insurance. It's supposed to cover this stuff, isn't it?" "It covers a good portion, yes," I said truthfully but vaguely. "But there are deductibles, co-payments, out-of-network charges, things it doesn't touch. It's still an enormous burden." I let my voice trail off, allowing the implication of financial ruin to hang heavy in the air. He stopped pacing, his eyes fixed on the pile of bills again, then on me, a new, almost desperate calculation dawning in his expression. This was it. The moment of truth. "You are so concerned about your inheritance, Raymond," I said, my voice thin but unshakably steady, my gaze meeting his directly. "Well, here it is. This is the current value of your inheritance. These are the costs of my life, the price of my fight to stay alive. Perhaps you'd like to start managing these assets now, since you're so eager for me to get my affairs in order." I gestured again to the horrifying stack. For a long moment he just stared at the bills, then at me, his face a mask of disbelief, then dawning horror. Not for me, I could see, but for himself, for the fortune he imagined slipping through his fingers. His carefully constructed composure finally shattered. "This is impossible," he exclaimed, his voice rising in anger and disbelief, all pretense of filial concern vanishing. "How could you let it get this expensive? You must have chosen the most extravagant treatments, the fanciest doctors. You should have been more careful, Mom. More frugal. Frugal? With my life." The irony was a bitter, burning thing. "At this rate," he continued, his voice now laced with a raw, selfish panic, "there'll be nothing left. Nothing for me. Nothing for the family. All those years Dad and you saved, it's all just going to be poured down the drain on this." He waved a dismissive hand towards me, towards the evidence of my life or death struggle. He didn't ask if I was scared. He didn't ask if I was in pain. He didn't offer a word of comfort, a shred of empathy. His only concern, his sole concern, was the money. His inheritance. The family estate he had so callously referred to when I was first diagnosed. He might have even, in his panic and fury, reiterated his earlier monstrous suggestion. Maybe you should reconsider some of these treatments, Mom. The really expensive ones. For the sake of preserving what's left. For everyone's future." I watched him, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. There was the unvarnished truth of my son's character. My intelligent, painful test had yielded the ugliest, most definitive result. He saw not his dying mother but a rapidly depreciating asset. He valued his inheritance over my life. The hope I had so foolishly clung to, that tiny ember of belief in his fundamental goodness, was finally, irrevocably extinguished. I said nothing. I just looked at him, letting my silence, my profound, sorrowful understanding of his true nature, be my only response. The quiet in the room was broken only by his agitated breathing, his muttered curses about bad investments, and irresponsible healthcare choices. He didn't stay long after that. He seemed to realize, perhaps, that there was no more money to be wheedled out of me, no estate left to manage, only a mountain of debt and a mother whose illness was proving far too costly for his liking. He left with a curt, almost accusatory, "Well, I hope you figure something out, Mom," the door closing behind him with a thud that felt like the lid of a coffin. Alone again, I looked at the pile of bills. They were still terrifying, yes. But now they represented something more. They were the crucible in which my son's soul had been tested, and found utterly, tragically wanting. My sadness was a vast, empty ocean. But within that ocean a new, cold current was beginning to flow. The current of a mother's final, just arrangement. He had made his choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. The thud of my front door closing behind Raymond echoed the final brutal slamming shut of a door in my heart. The one that had always held a desperate, hopeful space for the loving son I remembered, or perhaps, the son I had merely wished into existence. He was gone not just from my house, but from any illusion I might have still harbored about his character. The crucible of my illness, the terrifying spectacle of those medical bills, had not forged compassion in him. It had only refined his greed to its purest, ugliest essence. Alone again in my quiet, still living room, the mountain of white envelopes on the coffee table seemed to mock me. They were props in a play I had orchestrated, a painful drama designed to elicit a truth I already suspected but had been too afraid to confirm. The performance was over. The reviews were in. My son, my only child, valued my money, my estate, far more than my life, my comfort, or my peace of mind. A profound weariness settled over me, deeper than the fatigue from the chemotherapy, heavier than the constant ache of the cancer that was a relentless tenant in my body. It was the weariness of a mother who has finally seen the unvarnished soul of her child and found it wanting, found it cold, found it almost alien. There were no more tears to shed for him, not then. My sorrow had moved beyond that, into a desolate landscape of quiet acceptance. He was who he was. And I, Delia Ramsey, had to finally, truly accept that. The silence of the house was broken only by my own shallow breathing and the occasional rattling cough that was my constant companion. I looked at the bills again. For Raymond, they had represented the death of his inheritance. For me, they represented the fight for my life, a fight I was waging with every ounce of my dwindling strength. And thanks to Arthur's foresight and our years of careful planning, it was a fight I wouldn't have to wage alone, at least not financially. The next morning, with a clarity that felt almost serene after the storm of Raymond's visit, I began my own affairs. Not the kind he was so eager for me to settle for his benefit, but the kind that would secure my peace and ensure my final wishes were honored, untainted by his avarice. My first call was to Sarah Jenkins, the wonderfully efficient case manager at my insurance company. I'd spoken to her several times since my diagnosis, and she had always been kind, patient, and incredibly knowledgeable. "Sarah dear, it's Delia Ramsey," I said, my voice still a little weak but steady. "I've received another batch of statements from the hospital and the oncology clinic. They are rather overwhelming." "Oh, Mrs. Ramsey, please don't you worry about those initial statements," Sarah said immediately, her voice soothing. "We know they look terrifying. Just send them all through to us. We'll process them against your policy. Remember, you have excellent coverage. Your out-of-pocket maximum for the year is quite manageable, and you've nearly met it with the surgery costs. Most of these new charges will be covered at a very high percentage, if not entirely." "Yes, Sarah, I know," I said. "And I am so grateful for that. Arthur always said this policy was our best investment." I paused. I needed to hear it again today, I think. "Of course, Mrs. Ramsey," she said gently. "You focus on getting better. Let us handle the bills." Her words were a balm. My financial security, at least concerning the medical onslaught, was intact. Raymond's panic, his cruel suggestions that I curtail my treatment to preserve the estate, had been based on his own ignorant, greedy assumptions. He hadn't even bothered to understand the basics of the very insurance that was keeping his mother alive and his inheritance, which he clearly thought was already his, from being wiped out by medical debt. The irony was not lost on me. My next call was to Mr. Alistair Finch, the same meticulous, kind lawyer who had handled Arthur's estate so efficiently. He had helped me update my will briefly after Arthur's passing, but now a more significant revision was required. "Mr. Finch, it's Delia Ramsey. I need to make some rather urgent and definitive changes to my will and my power of attorney documents." He scheduled an appointment for me the following week, offering to come to my home given my health. When he arrived, I laid out the situation with Raymond, not with anger or hysterics, but with a quiet, factual recounting of his behavior since my diagnosis, culminating in his reaction to the medical bills. I didn't need to embellish. The truth was damning enough. Mr. Finch listened, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Delia," he said when I had finished, "this is deeply distressing. Your son's behavior is unconscionable." "It is what it is, Alistair," I replied, a weary resignation in my voice. "What I need now is to ensure my final wishes are clear, and that my care, should I become unable to make decisions for myself, is not entrusted to someone who values my assets more than my life." We spent several hours that afternoon meticulously restructuring my will. The bulk of my estate, the house Arthur and I had cherished, my modest savings and investments, the ones Raymond hadn't known about or couldn't yet touch, would now go to a combination of causes close to my heart. A significant portion to the Cancer Research Institute at the hospital where Dr. Chin was fighting so hard for me, another to the local hospice that had cared for Arthur with such dignity in his final days, and a smaller but still meaningful bequest to my sister's grandchildren, who had always shown me kindness. And Raymond? For my son Raymond Arthur Ramsey, I dictated to Mr. Finch, my voice clear and unwavering, I bequeath the sum of $1, and the full weight of the knowledge that his actions in my time of greatest need revealed a poverty of character far more devastating than any financial hardship. I also asked Mr. Finch to draft a letter, to be included with this token inheritance, detailing my profound disappointment and explaining exactly why he had been all but disinherited. It would not be a letter of anger but of deep, sorrowful truth. We also revoked any existing power of attorney he might have held and put in place a new one, naming Mr. Finch himself as my primary agent, and my dear friend Martha from my church group as a secondary, should I become incapacitated. My medical directives were reaffirmed, ensuring that my treatment decisions would be based on my wishes and medical advice, not on preserving an estate for an ungrateful heir. As Mr. Finch packed his briefcase, his expression was one of quiet respect. "You are a very strong woman, Delia," he said. I managed a faint smile. "One does what one must, Alistair. Arthur always said, plan for the worst, hope for the best, and meet whatever comes with your head held high." After he left, A profound sense of peace, albeit a lonely one, settled over me. My financial affairs were secure, protected by my insurance and now by my revised will. My future care was in trustworthy hands. Raymond's greed had been unmasked, at least to me, in its full, ugly glory. He would get his inheritance, a $1 and a mother's devastating final judgment. The cancer was still a battle I had to fight every day. The weariness, the pain, the uncertainty, those remained. But a different kind of weight had been lifted. The weight of my son's avarice, his suffocating expectations, his chilling disregard. My intelligence, the foresight Arthur and I had shared, had provided me with this lonely security. The sadness of my son's character was a wound that would likely never fully heal, but I would face my remaining time with dignity, my affairs in order, my true legacy secured not for him, but for causes that reflected the love and integrity Arthur and I had always valued. The truth, however ugly, had set me free to make my own final just arrangements. The weeks following my meeting with Mr. Finch, where I had so decisively restructured my will and secured my affairs, were a strange admixture of profound sadness and a quiet, unyielding strength. The cancer continued its relentless march, each day a fresh battle against pain and encroaching weakness. Yet a significant burden had been lifted. The gnawing anxiety about Raymond's avarice, his suffocating expectations, had been replaced by a somber acceptance of the truth of his character and the peace of knowing my final wishes were now protected, my legacy secured for causes that truly mattered to Arthur and me. Raymond did not call. He did not visit. After his furious departure from my home, the one where he'd been confronted with the terrifying prospect of my medical bills decimating his inheritance, a wall of silence had descended between us. Perhaps his lawyer had advised him to keep his distance pending any further action from my end. Perhaps he was too consumed by his own selfish panic and anger to even feign concern for his dying mother. Or perhaps most painfully he simply didn't care enough to try. The silence, in its own way, was his final, unambiguous answer to the test I had so sadly orchestrated. My days settled into a quiet routine, dictated by medical appointments, medication schedules, and the gentle ministrations of Martha, my dear friend from church, who Mr. Finch had listed as my secondary power of attorney. Martha was a rock, her steadfast kindness a balm to my wounded spirit. She'd bring me homemade soup, read to me when my eyes grew too tired, and listen patiently as I sometimes spoke of Arthur, of happier times, and very rarely of the deep aching sorrow I felt for the son I had lost, not to death but to his own flawed heart. I never told Martha the full ugly details of Raymond's reaction to the medical bills, nor the specifics of my revised will. It was a private grief, a private justice. But she knew, I think, that a profound shift had occurred, that I had made some difficult, necessary decisions. She saw the new peace in my eyes, a peace that coexisted with the ever-present shadow of my illness and the deeper shadow of my son's betrayal. Dr. Chin and her team at the Cancer Institute fought valiantly for me, their compassion a stark contrast to Raymond's cold indifference. My insurance, Arthur's final gift of foresight, continued to be the bedrock of my financial security, covering the astronomical costs of treatment without causing me undue worry about leaving behind a mountain of debt. I often thought, with a bitter irony, how Raymond's ignorance of its comprehensive nature had been the very thing that had so clearly unmasked his soul. He had seen only the terrifying gross figures, never understanding the net reality, because his panic had been about his inheritance, not my well-being. As my illness progressed, as my strength waned, I found myself spending more time in quiet reflection. My home, the one Arthur and I had filled with love, became my sanctuary. I reread old letters, looked through faded photograph albums, the memories bittersweet. There were so many happy times with Raymond as a boy, his bright, eager face, his childish hugs. Where had that boy gone? How had he become the grasping, callous man who could look at his dying mother and see only a dwindling estate? These were questions without answers, questions that would haunt the periphery of my thoughts until the very end. Mr. Finch visited occasionally, bringing papers to sign, updating me on the management of my affairs. He was always respectful, always kind, a true professional who understood the unspoken sorrow beneath my pragmatic instructions. He assured me that my revised will was ironclad, that my bequests to the Cancer Institute and the hospice would be honored, that my sister's grandchildren would receive their small legacy, and that Raymond would receive exactly what I had stipulated, $1. And a letter. The letter. I had drafted it myself, then had Mr. Finch review it for clarity, not for legal force, but for the precise articulation of a mother's broken heart. It wasn't a letter of rage or of condemnation, not entirely. It was, I hoped, a letter of sorrowful truth, a final attempt to reach some long-buried ember of conscience within him. I wrote of my love, of my sacrifices, of my dreams for him. And then, I wrote of my profound disappointment, of the unbearable pain his actions during my illness had caused, of the poverty of character he had revealed when faced with what he believed was the loss of his inheritance. I explained that my true legacy was not in the money he so craved, but in the values Arthur and I had tried to live by: integrity, compassion, love, values he had so tragically failed to inherit. My final days were peaceful as they could be under the circumstances. Martha was with me, holding my hand, her quiet presence a comfort. I thought of Arthur waiting for me. I thought of the good years, the love we had shared. And yes, I thought of Raymond, my lost son. Not with anger anymore, but with a deep, abiding sadness, a mother's eternal grief for a child who had strayed so far from the path of light. My intelligence, my foresight in maintaining that insurance had protected my financial legacy. It had allowed me to make my own choices, to ensure that what Arthur and I had worked for would go to causes that reflected our hearts, not to fuel a son's insatiable greed. But it couldn't protect me from the heartbreak of his betrayal. That was a wound no insurance policy could cover, no legal document could heal. My final arrangement, the $1 and the letter, was not an act of vengeance, not really. It was an act of truth. A final, quiet testament to the fact that some inheritances are not measured in dollars but in character. And in that, my son had found himself utterly, tragically bankrupt. My true legacy, I hoped, would be in the good my estate might do for others. A quiet echo of a life lived with love, integrity, and a sad, hard-won wisdom.